Welcome back to another incredible story of unexpected intervention and justice. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from today. Now, let me tell you about a day when an acting class at London's prestigious Royal Academy of Dramatic Art took an unexpected turn that would teach everyone present an unforgettable lesson about dignity and respect. The autumn rain fell steadily outside the century-old building's windows, creating a gray backdrop to the advanced acting workshop taking place inside. The classroom, with its high ceilings and traditional architecture, hosted 20 aspiring actors, each hoping to follow in the footsteps of RADA's illustrious alumni. Among them sat Marcus Thompson, a 15-year-old scholarship student whose worn uniform and scuffed shoes stood in stark contrast to the designer clothing worn by most of his classmates. What made this particular Thursday morning different was the presence of Jason Statham, who had agreed to observe the class as part of the Academy's mentor program. The action star sat quietly at the back of the room, his muscular frame relaxed but alert, watching the students work through their Shakespeare monologues with the kind of attention that had made him a master of his craft. Professor Adelaide Winchester, a woman in her 50s who took great pride in RADA's elite reputation, stood at the front of the class in her impeccably tailored suit. Her reputation for being particularly hard on scholarship students was well known throughout the academy, though she always claimed it was to prepare them for the harsh realities of the industry. Marcus had been working on his monologue from Henry V for weeks, practicing in the small bedroom he shared with his younger brother in their council flat. His mother, a hospital cleaner who worked double shifts to support her son's dreams, had helped him rehearse every night despite her exhaustion. The speech was perfect in their small room, but now, standing before the class, his nerves were beginning to show. Statham watched with particular interest as Marcus took his position at the front of the room. Having come from a similar background himself, he recognized the signs of a young man trying to bridge two different worlds. The action star's expression remained neutral, but his eyes followed every movement with the focus of someone who understood more than he revealed. Professor Winchester's voice cut through the quiet murmur of the classroom. "Marcus Thompson, since you've chosen King Henry's St. Crispin's Day speech, I trust you understand the gravity of the moment you're attempting to portray?" Her tone carried a hint of something that made several students exchange uncomfortable glances. Marcus stood straight, his second-hand uniform pressed as neatly as possible, though it couldn't hide the fact that he had grown several inches since it was purchased. "Yes, Professor Winchester," he replied, his voice carrying the slight accent of London's working class that the professor had repeatedly told him to work on. In the back of the room, Statham shifted slightly in his chair, his posture becoming more focused. He had witnessed similar scenes play out in his own youth, and something in the professor's tone had triggered his instinct for approaching conflict. "Very well," Professor Winchester said, adjusting her designer glasses. "Though I must say, it's rather ambitious for someone of your background to attempt such a royal role. But proceed." The comment caused several students to snicker, while others looked down at their desks, embarrassed by the obvious dig at Marcus's social status. Marcus began his monologue, his voice initially strong as he delivered the famous lines, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." But as he continued, Professor Winchester's expression grew increasingly disapproving, her pen tapping against her desk in a rhythm that seemed designed to throw off his concentration. "Stop, stop," she interrupted, holding up one manicured hand. "Mr. Thompson, are you aware that King Henry V was educated at the finest schools in England? That he was groomed from birth for greatness? How do you expect to capture his essence when your own experience is so limited?" The classroom had grown uncomfortably quiet. Marcus stood frozen at the front, his script trembling slightly in his hands. In the back of the room, Statham's expression had hardened, though he remained silent, watching the scene unfold with increasing intensity. "Perhaps," Professor Winchester continued, her voice dripping with false concern, "you should consider a character more appropriate to your station. Might I suggest one of the common soldiers? Or perhaps a servant role?" Each word was carefully chosen to cut deep, and their effect was visible in Marcus's reddening face. Several of the wealthier students smirked, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One girl near the front looked like she wanted to speak up but couldn't find the courage. The atmosphere in the room had become thick with tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. What no one in the room yet realized was that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Jason Statham, who had built his career playing characters who stood up against injustice, was about to demonstrate that some of his most powerful performances wouldn't be captured on film. The action star's eyes had narrowed slightly, his jaw set in a way that those familiar with his films would recognize as a prelude to significant action. He had risen from similar circumstances himself, fighting his way up from working-class beginnings to international stardom, and something about Marcus's situation struck a deeply personal chord. Professor Winchester, completely unaware of the storm she was brewing, continued her critique. Acting, Mr. Thompson, is about authenticity. How can you possibly expect to portray nobility when you've never experienced anything beyond your modest circumstances? She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Perhaps this Academy's scholarship program needs to be more selective. The threat to Marcus's future at the Academy hung in the air like a sword. Several students held their breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The professor, confident in her authority and social position, clearly expected her words to go unchallenged, as they had so many times before. What she didn't know was that her carefully constructed hierarchy was about to be dismantled by someone who understood both ends of the social spectrum she was so proudly defending. Jason Statham had remained silent throughout her diatribe, but his patience, like his silence, was about to end. The morning rain continued to fall outside the classroom windows, creating a dramatic backdrop to the scene that was about to unfold. In the front of the room, Marcus Thompson stood with his script clutched in his hands, unaware that his humiliation was about to become a moment of triumph, thanks to an unexpected champion who understood exactly what it meant to rise above society's expectations. The tension in Radha's classroom had reached a breaking point as Jason Statham rose from his chair at the back of the room. His movement was deliberate and controlled, carrying the same quiet power that had made him famous in action films. Every eye in the room followed him as he made his way toward the front, his footsteps echoing in the now silent classroom. "Interesting perspective, Professor Winchester," Statham said, his voice carrying that distinctive gravelly tone that had delivered countless memorable lines. "Tell me something, what do you know about Henry V's actual background?" The question was delivered with a calm that made it all the more impactful. Professor Winchester straightened her designer jacket, clearly thrown off by this unexpected intervention. "Well, of course, he was royalty, educated in the finest," she began, but Statham cut her off with a slight raise of his hand. "Actually," he said, moving to stand beside Marcus, who remained frozen at the front of the room, "Henry V spent his youth in the company of commoners. Shakespeare himself wrote about it. He learned leadership not in palace halls, but in taverns and streets, among the very people you seem so quick to dismiss." The professor's face flushed slightly as several students began nodding. Statham's knowledge of Shakespeare caught her off guard. She had clearly assumed the action star would be as limited in his understanding as she believed Marcus to be. "Mr. Statham," she attempted to regain control, "while that may be true, surely you understand the importance of proper breeding and education in portraying such roles?" Her voice carried a note of condescension that caused Statham's eyes to narrow slightly. "Proper breeding?" Statham repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air. "Let me tell you something about proper breeding. Before I became an actor, I was a street trader in London. My father was a street trader too. We sold whatever we could to make ends meet." The revelation caused a ripple of surprise through the classroom. Several students sat up straighter, their attention completely captured by this unexpected turn of events. Professor Winchester's expression flickered between disbelief and discomfort. "But that's different," she protested, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You've clearly transcended your origins to become—" Statham's quiet laugh interrupted her. "Transcended," he said, the word carrying a weight of experience. "No, Professor. I haven't transcended anything. I've built upon it. Every role I play, every character I create, is informed by where I came from. And let me tell you something, there's more authentic nobility in this young man's struggle to be here than in all your talk about proper breeding." "Marcus," who had been standing silently throughout this exchange, straightened slightly at these words. The script in his hands had stopped trembling, and his expression showed the first hints of renewed confidence. The greatest actors in history, Statham continued, his voice carrying throughout the room, didn't become great because they were born into the right families or wore the right clothes. They became great because they understood human nature. And you don't learn that in finishing schools or country clubs. Professor Winchester shifted uncomfortably behind her desk. The usual power dynamic of her classroom had been completely upended, and she found herself in the unfamiliar position of being the one taught a lesson. "You know what I see when I look at Marcus?" Statham asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I see someone who understands struggle, who knows what it means to fight for something. Tell me, Professor, what could be more relevant to Henry V's speech about brotherhood and courage?" Several students were now nodding enthusiastically, while others looked at their expensive clothes with new self-consciousness. The professor's earlier supporters had grown notably quiet, perhaps reflecting on their own assumptions. "Acting isn't about pretending to be something you're not," Statham continued, his voice taking on a teacher's clarity. "It's about finding the truth in every character, about understanding human experience in all its forms. And sometimes, Professor Winchester, those who have had to fight the hardest understand that truth the best." The rain outside had begun to ease, and rays of sunlight now broke through the clouds, streaming through the classroom's high windows. The natural spotlight seemed to highlight the contrast between the professor's rigid formality and Statham's authentic presence. "Marcus?" Statham turned to the young student. "Would you mind if I helped you with this scene?" The question was asked with genuine respect, making it clear this was a collaboration between equals, not a demonstration of superiority. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with newfound confidence. "Yes, sir. I'd be honored." The transformation in his bearing was already visible, the weight of the professor's criticism replaced by the support of someone who understood his journey. "Now," Statham addressed the class as a whole, "let's talk about what Henry V's speech really means. It's not about nobility of birth, it's about nobility of spirit. It's about leading men into battle not because of your title, but because of your character." Professor Winchester had sunk into her chair, her usual commanding presence diminished by each word. The students who had laughed at Marcus earlier now watched with rapt attention as Statham began breaking down the famous speech. "When Henry talks about his band of brothers," Statham explained, "he's not talking about aristocrats. He's talking about common soldiers, about men from every walk of life coming together for a greater purpose. Sound familiar, Marcus?" The young student nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. His own daily battles, the long bus rides to school, the extra jobs his mother took, the hours of practice in their small flat, suddenly seemed relevant to the historic speech in a way they hadn't before. "You see, Professor," Statham continued, his tone remaining respectful but firm, "your mistake isn't just in underestimating Marcus. It's in misunderstanding the very nature of great drama. Shakespeare wrote for everyone, kings and commoners alike. His greatest characters aren't great because of their titles, but because of their humanity." The classroom had become absolutely still, every person present aware they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just about defending one student from unfair criticism, it was about challenging the very assumptions that often limited art and opportunity. "So," Statham said, turning back to Marcus, "shall we show them what Henry V is really about?" The invitation carried the weight of someone who had fought his own battles against prejudice and won. The stage was set for a moment that would not only change Marcus's future at the academy but would challenge everyone present to reconsider their assumptions about art, ability, and the true meaning of nobility. The morning had transformed from a routine class into a masterclass in both acting and human dignity. The Rada classroom had transformed from a space of judgment into an impromptu theater as Jason Statham took position beside Marcus. The action star's presence seemed to fill the room, not with celebrity but with the kind of authentic authority that came from real experience. "Before we begin," Statham said, addressing the entire class, "let's talk about what makes Henry V's Street Crispin's Day speech so powerful. It's not the fancy language or the royal title, it's about a leader who understands his men's fears because he shares them. His eyes met Professor Winchester's as he continued, "It's about someone who knows what it means to be underestimated." The professor shifted uncomfortably in her chair as Statham turned to Marcus. "Now, tell me something. When you practice this speech at home, what do you think about?" The question was asked with genuine interest, creating a moment of connection that helped ease the young student's nervousness. "I think about my mom," Marcus answered, his voice growing stronger. "She works 2 jobs, sometimes 3. When I practice, I can hear her moving around the flat at 4 in the morning, getting ready for her cleaning shift at the hospital. She never complains, never gives up." Statham nodded, understanding, lighting his features. "That's your way in," he said. "Henry V isn't just talking about battle, he's talking about courage, about facing overwhelming odds with dignity." Sound familiar? Several students who had earlier smirked at Marcus's background now looked thoughtful, perhaps seeing their classmate in a new light. Professor Winchester's expression had shifted from dismissive to uncertain as she watched the interaction. "When Henry talks about his band of brothers," Statham continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "he's talking about people who stand together despite their differences. People who find strength in unity, not division." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Just like your mom and her coworkers at the hospital, yeah?" Marcus's eyes widened with understanding. Suddenly, the historical speech felt personal, relevant to his own life in ways he hadn't considered before. The script in his hands was no longer just words on paper, it was a bridge between his world and Henry's. "Now," Statham said, taking a few steps back, "show us what you've got. But this time, don't try to sound like what you think a king should sound like. Sound like someone who understands what it means to fight against the odds." The classroom fell silent as Marcus took a deep breath. When he began speaking, his voice was different, not the forced posh accent he'd been trying to adopt, but his natural voice filled with genuine emotion. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." The words rang out clear and true, carrying the weight of personal understanding. Marcus wasn't just reciting Shakespeare anymore. He was channeling every early morning he'd watched his mother leave for work, every struggle his family had faced, every moment of determination against adversity. Statham watched with approval, occasionally nodding as Marcus continued the speech. The young student's working-class accent, which Professor Winchester had tried so hard to eliminate, now gave the words an authenticity that captured the true spirit of Henry V's message. "For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." As Marcus delivered these lines, his voice carried the same kind of raw honesty that had made Statham's own performances so compelling. The other students sat transfixed, many of them hearing the famous speech as if for the first time. Professor Winchester's expression had transformed from skepticism to surprise as she witnessed the performance. The very qualities she had criticized Marcus's background, his accent, his life experience, were now giving the historical speech a powerful resonance she couldn't deny. "Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition." Marcus's delivery of these lines carried special weight, as if challenging the very prejudices he had faced. Statham's slight smile showed he recognized the particular significance of this moment. As the speech continued, something remarkable happened in the classroom. The barriers of class and privilege that had seemed so important earlier began to dissolve. Students who had previously looked down on Marcus now leaned forward in their seats, caught up in the authenticity of his performance. "And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here." The words echoed through the room, carrying not just historical significance but contemporary relevance. This wasn't just about a medieval battle anymore. It was about the daily battles fought by people like Marcus and his mother. Statham moved quietly around the room as Marcus performed, his presence serving as a living reminder that success in the arts wasn't about background or breeding, but about understanding and conveying human truth. Each student he passed seemed to sit up straighter, as if absorbing this unspoken lesson. "This story shall the good man teach his son." As Marcus approached the speech's conclusion, his voice carried a strength and dignity that no amount of elocution lessons could have provided. He wasn't just performing Henry V, he was speaking for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The sunlight streaming through the classroom windows had grown stronger, creating a natural spotlight that seemed to highlight the transformation taking place. This wasn't just a drama class anymore. It was a moment of revelation about the true nature of art and authenticity. Professor Winchester sat in uncharacteristic silence, her earlier certainties about proper breeding and appropriate roles crumbling in the face of this powerful demonstration. The notebook where she had been writing her critical comments lay forgotten on her desk. As Marcus delivered the final lines, his voice carried a quiet triumph that had nothing to do with victory in battle and everything to do with personal victory over prejudice and limitation. The classroom remained absolutely still, caught in that magical moment after a truly authentic performance. Statham was the first to break the silence, beginning to applaud with the kind of genuine appreciation that could only come from someone who understood the journey. The other students quickly joined in, their applause carrying not just approval but a new understanding of their classmate. The morning had become more than a lesson in acting. It had become a demonstration of how art could bridge social divides and challenge preconceptions. The stage was set for a final moment that would drive home these lessons in a way none of the students would ever forget. As the applause died down in the RADA classroom, Jason Statham stepped forward once again, his presence now carrying not just authority but the weight of the lesson just delivered. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the high windows, illuminating a room that had been transformed by more than just natural light. "That," Statham said, his voice carrying clearly through the silence, "is what real acting looks like. Not pretending to be something you're not, but finding the truth in your own experience and connecting it to the character." He turned to face Professor Winchester, his expression firm but not unkind. That's something no amount of finishing school can teach. The professor sat at her desk, her usual imperious demeanor completely dismantled by what she had just witnessed. Her perfectly manicured hands folded and unfolded in her lap as she struggled to reconcile her previous assumptions with the powerful performance she had just witnessed. "You see," Statham continued, addressing the entire class but keeping his eyes on the professor, "I've worked with actors from every background imaginable. The ones who succeed aren't the ones with the fanciest training or the proper breeding. They're the ones who understand life, real life, with all its struggles and triumphs." Marcus stood quietly beside him, his posture now carrying a confidence that had nothing to do with artificial refinement and everything to do with newfound self-assurance. The script in his hands was no longer a source of anxiety but a testament to his achievement. "When I started in this industry," Statham went on, his voice taking on a thoughtful quality, "plenty of people told me I didn't belong. Wrong accent, wrong background, wrong everything. Sound familiar, Marcus?" The young student nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Professor Winchester finally found her voice, though it had lost its earlier condescension. "Mr. Statham, while the performance was impressive, surely you must agree that classical training..." She trailed off as Statham held up his hand. "Classical training is valuable," he acknowledged, "but it's a tool, not a substitute for real understanding. Shakespeare wrote for everyone, kings and commoners alike. He understood something that seems to have been forgotten in some corners of our industry. Great art speaks to universal human experience, not just the experiences of the privileged few." The other students were frantically taking notes now, recognizing that they were witnessing something more significant than a regular drama class. This was a masterclass in both acting and life lessons. "Marcus," Statham turned to the young student, "tell the class what you were thinking about during that last part of the speech. The part about gentlemen in England now, Abed." Marcus straightened, his voice steady now. "I was thinking about my little brother, watching me practice in our room. About how I want him to know that where we come from doesn't limit where we can go." The simple honesty of his answer brought tears to several students' eyes. "That," Statham said emphatically, "is what makes performance powerful. Not pretending to be something you're not, but finding the universal truth in your own story." He turned back to Professor Winchester. "That's something that can't be taught in elocution lessons or deportment classes." The professor's face had progressed through several shades of red during this exchange, but now it showed something new, the beginning of understanding. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "I have been somewhat limited in my perspective." "It's never too late to learn," Statham replied, his voice carrying no judgment. That's another thing Shakespeare understood: the capacity for growth, for change, for seeing beyond our initial prejudices. He moved to the center of the room, commanding attention without effort. Let me tell you something about proper breeding and appropriate backgrounds. Before I became an actor, I spent years diving competitively for the British national team. Not exactly a typical path to Shakespeare, yeah? But every experience, every struggle, every triumph, it all adds to what you can bring to a role. The students were hanging on every word, many of them seeing their own assumptions about acting and class being challenged. Even those from privileged backgrounds were beginning to understand that their experiences, while different from Marcus's, were just one part of the human story that art could tell. "Professor Winchester," Statham said, turning back to the still subdued teacher, "you have an opportunity here. These students don't need to be taught how to hide who they are. They need to be taught how to use who they are, where they come from, what they've lived through." The professor nodded slowly, years of ingrained prejudices beginning to crack under the weight of the morning's lessons. "Mr. Statham, would you consider speaking to more of our classes? Perhaps helping us develop a more inclusive approach to teaching?" The action star's response was immediate and characteristic. "Only if Marcus here gets to help. I think he's just demonstrated he has something valuable to teach about finding authenticity in classical roles." Marcus's eyes widened at the suggestion, while his classmates nodded enthusiastically. The same students who had snickered at his background earlier now looked at him with genuine respect. "And one more thing," Statham added, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Let's talk about that scholarship program you mentioned earlier. Instead of making it more selective, maybe it's time to make it more inclusive. After all, talent doesn't check bank accounts before choosing where to land." The impact of these words was visible on every face in the room. Several of the wealthier students looked thoughtful, perhaps considering their own privileges for the first time. Professor Winchester, who had started the morning so certain of her hierarchical view of art and society, now sat in contemplative silence. "Marcus," Statham said, turning to the young student one last time, "never let anyone tell you that your experiences aren't valid, that your voice isn't worthy, that your background is a limitation rather than an asset. In fact," he added with a slight smile, "I'd say you're exactly what RADA needs more of." The morning had transformed from a potential tragedy of crushed dreams into a powerful lesson about authenticity, opportunity, and the true nature of art. As the class prepared to end, it was clear that everyone present had learned something valuable about acting, about prejudice, and about the power of standing up for what's right. Let us know in the comments if you've ever faced prejudice about your background, or if you've witnessed someone standing up against discrimination. Share this video to spread the message that talent and authenticity know no social boundaries. Thanks for watching, and remember, true art isn't about where you come from, it's about what you bring to it. Sometimes the most powerful performances come from those who've been told they don't belong. See you in the next video.